Hello and welcome to Recovery Weekly, an interactive weekly program used to guide you, the family member of an individual with a substance abuse problem, through the process of recovery. I'm your host, Scott Kaline, joined as always by my co-host, Ian Koch. Ian is a licensed drug and alcohol counselor as well as an internationally certified addiction specialist with northeastAddictionConsultants.com. Good morning, Ian. Today we have a guest, Lisa Frederiksen, and she is the author of 9 books and a national keynote speaker with 25 years experience. She has been consulting, researching, writing, and speaking on substance abuse, addiction, education, prevention, intervention, and treatment, dual diagnosis, underage drinking, and help for the family centered around 21st century brain and addiction related research since 2003. Thanks for joining us, Lisa.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Both of you.
Ian wanted to mention that today is Alcoholics Anonymous birthday at 77 years old today. So if you want to explain a little bit about that, Ian.
Yeah, I think happy birthday to Alcoholics Anonymous. And usually for people in recovery, it's a big deal. One of the things that I think so fascinating about the whole Alcoholics Anonymous and the birthday is that 77 years ago, today marks the day that one of the co-founders, Dr. Bob, actually left the hospital and finished his step work and made his amends and started really rebuilding his life. Up until that point, one of the co-founders, Bill, or the other co-founder, Bill, went to see Dr. Bob. They talked a little bit, but Dr. Bob wasn't really willing to work the steps. He was willing to do some of it, but was afraid his reputation would be ruined because he was a doctor and this, that, and the other thing, and said he wasn't going to do it. He ended up drinking again, and then when he eventually did go out and make amends, that's really the birth, June 10th, of Alcoholics Anonymous. The other exciting note, I think I kind of use that as my reference point of when addiction treatment really started. You know, prior... That was in 1934. Up until 1955, if you were an alcoholic or a drug addict who couldn't get sober, you were locked up and put in an insane asylum. So imagine all these normal people just sitting around drinking coffee, playing cards, not being able to do anything. You know, they were given treatments like the belladonna treatment, which in high doses was a hallucinogenic. That didn't really work. They were giving people concoctions of drinks and things, and the hydrotherapies, and none of that stuff really worked until Alcoholics Anonymous. So it became this kind of pivotal moment. And initially, the first drug and alcohol counselors that the country used, the certified addiction counselors, were hand-picked people out of Alcoholics Anonymous, where they said to some people, hey, you really know what's going on. Why don't you be a counselor? They trained them a little bit in how to do counseling. And that's how we kind of got the birth of treatment. So
wow.
It's a pretty big day, I think.
Pretty grassroots effort there, yeah, in the beginning. It's great. Well, today we'll be focusing on addiction as a brain disease and what coping with the disease does to the brains of family members that are affected by it. And Lisa is pretty well versed on all this subject. And now, Lisa, what made you decide to focus your efforts on addiction in, say, like the last decade or so?
Okay. In 2003, one of my loved ones entered a residential treatment program for alcoholism, and they had a family component. It was family group, and then a session where the families met with the clients together and then separately as a family. And that plunged me into the whole world of codependency. And I dabbled in that. I say dabbled in the sense that I had tried to understand this about a decade prior to that, but couldn't get past the idea that alcoholism was a disease. I just didn't make sense to me. It seemed because, for example, I'd been bulimic for 11 years, and so I thought people could learn to re-drink the way I had learned to re-eat. And at that time, I had published 6 other books, 4 of them biographies about women and leaders in the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. So I just sort of shifted my research efforts into trying to understand why they called alcoholism a disease. Oh. And out of that was just this whole unfolding recent research, because imaging technologies have just developed in the last 10, 15 years that allow scientists and medical professionals to study the live human brain in action, over time, and under the influence. And what that did was help all of us start to understand addiction or alcoholism, whether it's drugs or alcohol, as a chronic, often relapsing brain disease. And that to me was this whole shift. Oh my gosh, so it really wasn't them. It wasn't their true nature coming out, for example. My first book was titled If You Love Me, You'd Stop. And I think for family members, that's sort of a mantra we start to adopt. Why don't you stop? You know, if I'm not important enough to you, thinking that there's something that they can do if they want it to badly enough. And the problem is that we just don't understand addiction as a brain disease. And as a brain disease, if there's substance in that brain, you can't have a different outcome. So that, and then understanding from there, then it just kind of unraveled, and I started to understand that I have several family members and friends who either abuse or are addicted or in recovery for substance use, abuse, and dependence. And it was just kind of a whole sea change. So I wanted to share that research because for me, the science took away the stigma, and it took away, I could see the disease as something separate from the person. You know, we often talk about somebody has cancer. We don't say they're a canceric. And so these are people with illnesses. Drug addiction and alcoholism are brain diseases, and these are people that have an illness. They're not their illness. And so treatment then needs and is evolving so that we can start to separate the two, treat the illness, and respect the individual, hopefully societally. And that's kind of been my passion, is to try to help the broader audience understand this for what it is. That was a long answer.
That was perfect. Thank you. Yes, you are a very well-accomplished author, as I found out in the last week or so, and I actually picked up your book, Crossing the Line from Alcohol Use to Abuse to Dependence, Debunking Myths About Drinking Alcohol That Can Cause a Person to Cross the Line, which it debunked a lot of common myths about drinking, and some of these you forget that are like I've seen them enough now that they're common to me, but some people come across them and think this is, I had no idea. Like one specifically was that the weekend binge drinker could end up suffering brain damage from just, the twice a week that they actually do drink. That over the years, I mean, can you tell me what kind of repercussions they actually face?
Sure. That is one of the biggest misconceptions, and it was for myself as well. I thought drinking was normal or alcoholic. And so we never wanted to label our loved ones, or most of us don't, as an alcoholic because maybe they still go to work, or most of them do. In fact, it's most alcoholics do function. And somehow the label of alcoholism or alcoholic or drug addict, makes them a bad, morally weak person. So we never want to attach that label. And so we go along through this period of substance abuse, trying to, make them change, drop it back, do it differently, if you will. And it's that period that the brain starts to chemically and structurally change, because substances are chemicals and they work in the brain's natural neural network processing, and start to either they interrupt it, or they mirror some of the neurotransmitters, for example, or latch into receptors. They change the way the brain actually works. And those brain changes then affect, overall health, because all substances get to the brain through the bloodstream. Alcohol, for example, is one that I think a lot of people don't understand how it does. It doesn't go through the digestive process. We don't digest it like other foods and liquids, so it passes right through the stomach into the small intestine, into the bloodstream, and travels throughout the body to body organs high in water content and highly vascularized, like the brain. The only way alcohol leaves the system is through enzymes breaking it down in the liver. and it takes the liver about 1 hour to break down the alcohol in one standard drink. While it's waiting for its hour out the liver, alcohol sits in other body organs, and that's then what sets up this chemical and structural change in the brain, and it's also what causes other physical ailments. A lot of cancers, not a lot, some cancers, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, the heart organ itself, liver ailments. So it's not just the brain either. It's many, many body organs.
Okay. I just want to stop real quick and explain that this is an interactive show, so if you have any questions for Lisa or Ian, feel free at any moment to enter them into the chat box feature to the right of this video. Now, Lisa, what prevents, in some cases, the individual themselves from crossing the line, as you say, from alcohol abuse to alcohol dependence?
Okay, so this is something else, is that addiction, whether to alcohol or drugs, is a progressive disease. People are not born alcoholics, and that's something else we tend to have a misperception about. It because of the way it works in the brain, the substance abuse changes the chemical and structural makeup of the brain. It makes then the brain more susceptible to what they call the 5 key risk factors. And those are childhood trauma, so verbal, physical, or emotional abuse, which as a child's brain is developing, which occurs from birth through 25, what's going on in that particular early stages is wiring in brain changes when there is childhood trauma. So childhood trauma is one. Mental illness is another, like anxiety or depression, because that's also a brain changer, if you will. And social environment. So if you're growing up in an environment where heavy drinking is seen as normal, you might drink to that same level when you start to drink, thinking, well, this is what we do, and it might not work in your particular brain structuring. And then genetics. And it's not that there's an addiction gene, it's rather that there's a combination. We have 25,000 genes in our DNA, and the way those all go together, some of us have predispositions to eye color or height or hair color based on our family of origin, our genetics. And so the same thing happens with substance, or with it could be higher or lower levels of a neurotransmitter or a receptor or enzymes in the liver that break down alcohol, for example. So that's the genetic component. And then the last one is early use. We used to think the brain was developed by around 12. That it goes through incredible brain changes from 12 through 25 related to puberty, because that's also where the brain is changing the body and the brain. And again, the brain controls everything we think, feel, say, and do through neural networks in the brain, and then through the nervous system talking through other parts of the body as my hands go up and down. Anyway, that's a long pattern. So, so the early use, and so it's puberty, cerebral cortex. The brain is not developed at 12. The last part to evolve in the species and to develop is the cerebral cortex, and that's the judgment, the thinking, the brakes on the risk-taking of puberty, and then strengthening and pruning. And that's where we strengthen the neural networks we use. They become myelinated to make a smoother connection, if you will, and then those that aren't go into disuse. So it's a really complex piece. You have the alcohol abuse that sets you up to be susceptible to these risk factors. But early use is one of the key risk factors for developing a long-time problem because of that developmental process that's going on. And if I might just take another moment on the puberty picture, the species lived about 25 years. So puberty kicked in around 12 to create an adult body and to push the species to go off, if you will, rely on its peers. Now that made sense when you died at 25, because when you were going through puberty around 12, mom and dad were dead, so you had to look to your peer group to survive. Now we have much more complicated long-term lives, and so the part of the brain that then starts to kick in that gives us that capability, and kind of think of it, a 12-year-old was not doing a tax return, for example. Those kinds of adult complex thinking patterns and reasoning are evolving with the cerebral cortex, which is also then the brake on that, pushing that limbic system. So it's that lag time between kind of 12-ish and 15, 16-ish, when a lot of times young people they don't think through why they're making the decisions that they're doing. It's just, yeah, go. And so we look at kids and we go, why are you doing that? Well, they really don't know, because that part hasn't kind of caught up. You don't know you've made a mistake till you've made it, so you have the hindsight to go, well, that didn't work. So this is somewhere where children in particular, under 15, I think it's 4 times are more likely to, if they start substancing, binge drinking, for example, more likely to develop alcoholism later in life. And so the longer young people can wait until their brain fully develops, the better for their long-term experiences with alcohol.
Let me ask a question. In terms of addictions, the other addictions, right? Gambling, sex, overeating. Does this stuff apply?
I don't study those. Excuse me. It gets too complex to be able to speak, accurately in all of it. So I've just stayed with drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
And now you were saying that it develops early in puberty, but I've heard often said that alcohol kind of, in some cases, stunts growth mentally, and I think you were touching on that a little bit, but like not to the extent where you don't develop in other ways, but like, does it, your maturity level, does that suffer from drinking at an early age and letting it take over?
Yeah, if you look at it sort of as a lost neural network opportunity instead of, if you're spending your time substancing, finding, seeking, hiding, recovering from, stealing, all of that focus, those are the networks that will be myelinated and strengthened. And the ones that might have been spent, during learning math or other activities, won't be. And see, there's an expression that says networks or neurons that fire together, brain cells in this connective process, wire together, and they form brain maps around the activities that we do. And this is a wonderful thing about the species, because just imagine if we had to think through everything we do in a day. Gosh, we'd probably get stuck on coffee. But it just starts to take over for us. And so when you're in an addictive type cycle, that becomes the strengthened piece. So once you remove the substance from the brain, and so then the brain can start to heal and wire off in the ways that you now want to spend your time or your brain efforts thinking, then you can have different outcomes.
Right.
So did that answer your question, or?
It did, very much so. Thank you.
Okay.
You mentioned in your book the idea of secondhand drinking, which I had never heard that term before, but I like it a lot. It refers to the effects that one person's drunken behavior has on the friends and family, and how it can be just as destructive as alcohol abuse itself on the individual. Do you mind expanding on that concept a little?
Sure. It's a term that I coined when we quit going after the smoker to stop smoking and instead went after secondhand smoke. Societally, we started to look at, oh, wow, smoke causes an impact on other people. In our world, we tend to talk about that as codependency. And so everybody just shuts down and goes, well, that's not me because I'm not codependent, because we don't really understand the term or the concept or how it applies. So if you think of it as secondhand drinking, the person that's on the receiving end of the drinking behaviors. And drinking behaviors are the change in the person that occur because of alcohol interrupting the way the brain normally functions. So that's being on the receiving end of the verbal fights or the insane circular arguments or physical assault or emotional neglect or assault or unplanned, unwanted, unprotected sex, driving while impaired. They say they're fine to drive, you might believe them and get in the car to drive with them. So that's the person who's receiving this. And what starts to happen, particularly if you grow up with it or you're chronically exposed to it, is your brain gets stuck in fight or flight. And so you become kind of chronically activated in the fight or flight stress response system. And that system unleashes, you cannot believe, I would read it, but it's a very long section in my book, all that happens in the body. And it was meant to make the species run from the great woolly mammoth. Again, thinking back to early man who died at about 25. in the human species, we never run. We never expend what all that was for. So we just sit and kind of just keep packing it on, depending on what we're exposed to. And this causes the species to stress anywhere, but you start to react to the emotion as if it's a fact. So in the limbic system, where most of this is taking place in the family system, and I think this is definitely a family disease, the addict alcoholic is in the pleasure reward, and the family member is in the fight or flight. Neither are in the cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain that can say, whoa, wait a minute, here comes my anger. It's not about the man who's driving poorly. It's about, I'm so upset about what happened last night, and I'm going to, that type thing. So what we need to do to help family members understand is this piece that happens so that they can push themselves out of that reactionary mode and get into where they can, kind of think it through. So Dr. Ratty has this wonderful expression, and is it a stick or a snake? And what happens to family members is we start to see every emotional response as a snake, something we've got to do something about, instead of, well, wait a minute, this isn't an emergency. I have some time here. I can think this through. So while all this stuff, for lack of a better word, is sitting, a lot of times family members suffer anxiety or depression, or they'll get migraines or, stomach problems, let alone just emotionally becoming so focused on whether this is happening or not, that they're not really in the world of where they are at the moment. At work, they're worried about what happened last night, or what's going to happen at school today, or what's going to happen when he picks up the kids. So you're not really present in the moment. So it's a huge thing for family members. And I think once we understand addiction as a brain disease, if the substance is in the brain, there will be no different outcomes, so don't try to make one. And then for the family member, okay, so now what am I going to do?
Yeah, this pattern happens all the time with families. And a lot of the families that we work, this is what we work around. Yes. He said he needs money because his car broke down. What? Oh my God, I got to get him money. Right. Because mom or dad assume that that money is all of a sudden going to fix whatever the problem is, when it usually contributes to the problem. And it becomes these behaviors where families, especially around addiction, it's so difficult for them to be able to step back and say, this is not an emergency. Oh, okay. Where it becomes the fix it mentality. I'll fix it. But the truth with addicts and alcoholics is sometimes it's okay that their credit card payment is late. It's okay that they didn't make their car payment. It's okay that they got fired. Right. We have to get back to a society where families are willing to let their kids, or I should say loved ones in general, find some mistakes and have the integrity to make a mistake and learn from it, because teaching that if, Scott, you go to court and I'll just pay all your fines and get you a very expensive lawyer, what I'm teaching you is that if you get in trouble, I'll deal with it. Right. I'll fix it for you. Right. When it's, okay, you gotten in trouble, X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. I recently, about a month ago, I worked with a mother. She brought her son to see me because she didn't want him to smoke pot anymore. He was 16, and we were talking, and of course he wasn't the slightest bit interested in not smoking pot. He was 16, and he eventually got pulled over, which I warned him about. He got pulled over. In that process, mom called me hysterical. Oh, now he's in trouble. I said, well, what are you going to do? And she said, well, I just spent $4,000 on a retainer for a lawyer who said he could get rid of the case. And I said to her, so do you want your kid to stop smoking pot or what? Yeah. She said, well, of course I do. I said, so then why don't you let him take some consequences? But his whole life will be ruined. And the truth is no. A misdemeanor pot charge is not going to ruin anyone's life. Mm-hmm. And that's so important that families learn how to apply boundaries that are realistic, that they can stand up with.
And I think you're right. With the parent role, it is particularly difficult because you don't know whether you're being a parent. Good parent does blah, blah, blah. And so it's really difficult to understand that the boundaries are what will really start to cause the person to change the behavior. When you keep running into a dead end and it doesn't go away, you're going to have to start to look at the fact that it's the substance in your brain that's causing this, period. It's not a bad day. It's not a good day. It's not your friends. It's nothing else but that.
So it's almost as if the mother's or the father's role in this case turns from being a nurturer to a disciplinarian, where they, in some cases never have even had to be that person until the teen years, when they do start to first experiment and see what's out there in the world. So yes, I agree with both of you in that it takes on a lot of different angles when it comes to be, how do I deal with my child who I don't even recognize anymore? They used to be this or that, and it's like, lay it down the law, show them what's up.
And I think it's too important to remember in that period that when you're 12, that's the hard part for parents. I know it was for me too. You're going, wait a minute, what happened to that, quote unquote person from there? But remember the brain, the way it's developing right now. Imagine, and we all have been through it, what it was like from suddenly you went from 11 years old and 362 days to 12 years old and 3 days, say, when puberty hits. That whole unleashing of hormonal and physical changes and, sexual attractions is just part of the species, the way we were wired to reproduce because we died at 25. But we don't talk about it openly like this as just a mechanics of the species, if you will, so that we can understand and help kids understand all this stuff you're feeling right now is very normal. You're not, dirty or perverted or, those kinds of things that we tend to associate with it. And so they could understand then that it's going to be natural for me to want a substance. That's just part of this brain development period. So I need to, be aware of this. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we need to change also how we talk about that period, because by the time 15, 16 comes, this is the stuff that's been happening from 12 till then. Now you want to start to change this when it's already sort of locked into the brain, so we need to kind of back up underage substance abuse prevention to elementary school in taking it from a brain understanding component rather than don't do. It's bad for you. Well, yeah, but it's not going to be bad for me because the species doesn't believe that. We don't see consequences at that age. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Now, I want to thank you, Lisa, for joining us today. How can people get in contact with you with any questions or anything they may have?
My email address is Lisa F. and then at Breaking the Cycles, and you need an S at the end of cycle, breakingthecycles.com. And my number is 650-362-3026, and I'm happy to answer questions or take email questions.
Okay. And Ian, would you have anything else to add today?
No, I think we're good. Lisa, thanks for coming on. It was really special to have you talk about the brain. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Okay.
And if you are looking for help, please visit northeasternaddictionconsultants.com or call 1-800-723-1073. And thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope the best for you and your loved ones.